Archie Manning.
As Spurrier threads the needle for another touchdown.
Randy Campbell gives to Bo Jackson. Jackson's on his way. Goodbye. In your face. 71 yards for Bo Jackson.
45. There goes Davis. Oh, my God. Davis is going to run it all the way back. Auburn's going to win the football game. Auburn's going to win the football game. He ran the missed field goal back.
It just means more. The tagline that brings pride for some who point to championships and enrages others who immediately point to bowl season. The SEC, far and away, has firmly planted itself as the conference of more. They did so recently with their landmark additions of Oklahoma and Texas, but they've always been one of the premier conferences in college sports history, in pretty much every major sport. Think back to Herschel Walker, Danny Werfel, all four Mannings. Football, basketball, baseball, track. The SEC has risen to being considered one of the country's greatest collegiate athletic conferences, right alongside the Big Ten. They're considered so good, so historically successful, that there are serious plans for them in the Big Ten to separate themselves from the powers of college sports entirely. But how does a college conference get to this point? How does a group of Southern schools get so powerful that they're considered more of a force than the organization that supposedly oversees them? The history of the SEC starts with the Southern Conference. I've discussed the SoCon a little bit already in my History of the ACC video, since that conference has its roots in plenty of conferences at the modern level. In fact, almost 20% of Division I FBS schools have at one point been members of the SoCon. It was founded in 1921 as a split from the Southern Intercollegiate Athletics Association, with members Alabama, Auburn, which was then called Alabama Polytechnic, Clemson, Georgia, Georgia Tech, Kentucky, Maryland, Mississippi A&M, North Carolina, NC State, Tennessee, Virginia, Virginia Tech, and Washington and Lee. Florida, LSU, Ole Miss, South Carolina, Tulane, and Vanderbilt would join later in 1922. In that same year, athletic competition would begin, albeit without freshmen. The SoCon was also the first conference to consider postseason tournaments to determine conference champions for sports like basketball. The SoCon would sit like this for 10 years, adding schools like Sewanee in 1923, VMI in 1924, and Duke in 1928. But it had grown too large to really value the schools inside of it. As early as 1932, some schools decided that the number of schools in the SoCon, 23 at the time, was too large to logically have every school be a meaningful member. There were also some issues with postseason play and bowl games, with the SoCon leaning towards banning schools from postseason play entirely. So some regionalization was determined to be the right choice by a few school athletics heads. These colleges were that of Sewanee, Georgia Tech, Tulane, Alabama, Auburn, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, LSU, Ole Miss, Mississippi State, Tennessee, and Vanderbilt. They did this at the annual SC meetings in Knoxville, Tennessee, localizing themselves as the non-coastal colleges and electing their first conference president, Frank McVeigh. McVeigh had been the president of the University of Kentucky since 1917, and would continue in that post as well as SEC leadership until 1940. The first season of organized SEC play would take place in 1933, with, of course, only white student athletes. The SEC was instantly as industrious as its later counterparts would be, hinting towards an eventual dominance at the highest level of the sport. Ironically enough, the first football champion would be the Alabama Crimson Tide, sporting a record of 7-1-1 overall. But the first national champion to unite under the SEC banner was actually LSU's track and field program, which won the national title in 1933. 1933 also brought the first winless conference record from the Sewanee Tigers, who finished at 3-6. Unfortunately for Sewanee, theirs is perhaps the saddest story of SEC membership early on. There once was a time when Sewanee had a stretch of some of the greatest football of all time, notoriously going undefeated in 1899, outscoring opponents 322-10, and earning the nickname of the Iron Tigers. But through 8 seasons of SEC football, already the most popular sport in the conference, Sewanee had failed to win a single SEC game. Sewanee was a small private school in Tennessee, and was quickly surpassed in attendance and prestige by the rest of the schools in the conference. It was harder and harder to improve their program from the same starting point as everyone else, especially as stadiums started getting bigger and recruiting started to become a thing. They decided to stop offering athletic scholarships in 1940, and as such, dropped out of the SEC willingly, leaving the conference with an even 12 members. Speaking of athletic scholarships, the SEC was the first conference to legalize the admission of athletic scholarships to potential athletes, which created a massive recruiting boom and shifted the entire practice of recruiting on its head. 1940 also brought the first official commissioner to the SEC. The first office of the commissioner was formed and placed in Jackson, Mississippi, with former Mississippi Governor Martin S. Connor being assigned to the role. With his health failing later on, though, the office was switched to Tennessee's Dean Doherty, and 2 years later, officially moved to Birmingham, Alabama, with the appointment of former LSU coach Bernie H. Moore. As I'm sure you can already see, this roster of schools instantly created some of the more vibrant rivalries in college sports as soon as the SEC was established. Alabama and Auburn had played football intermittently since the early 1890s, but it wasn't really one of the sport's most vibrant rivalries until after a hiatus between games was canceled in 1948. Due to the small size of Hare Stadium in Auburn at the time, multiple teams, such as Alabama, Tennessee, and Georgia Tech, flat out refused to play there, so the soon-to-be-called Iron Bowl began being played at Legion Field in Birmingham, Alabama, where it would stay until it returned to each college's campus in 1989. Since then, it has become one of college sports' most visible and intense rivalries to date. It's joined by the Magnolia Bowl between Louisiana State and Mississippi. Like other SEC rivalries, it began in its infancy while the schools were members of the SoCon, but didn't reach its peak importance until the 50s, when both schools were winning national championships and their paths often crossed. The University of Georgia finds themselves sandwiched between two of their rivals, both incredibly vibrant in their own scope, in the Florida Gators and Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets. One only needs to think of the names of these rivalries to see their importance to college football and college sports as a whole. One, the world's largest outdoor cocktail party. The other, clean, old-fashioned hate. But as the SEC was beginning to grow into their own as the years moved on from the 40s and 50s, it also became clear that they were the victim of their own inability to move on and grow from their past sins and the current sins of the world around them. Former Alabama alum and governor of Alabama George Wallace stated in 1963, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever." Jim Crow laws upheld the practice of segregation in many places across the United States, creating different institutions that were separate but definitely not equal. And that was the standard operating procedure for the SEC, even as university after university around them allowed African American students to attend their colleges and play sports for them. Historically black colleges and universities, commonly shortened to HBCUs, had attracted high-level athletic talent for decades. The Central Intercollegiate Athletics Conference was formed a full 6 years before the Southern Conference was formed, and featured powerhouse programs like Hampton, Howard, and Virginia Union. Later, in 1920, the Southwestern Athletic Conference would be formed, and many other conferences of historically black colleges began to be formed. At the collegiate level, these colleges often didn't play their larger counterparts, mostly because those larger counterparts, like the SEC, flat out refused to play them. But they were still able to succeed based off of the athletic talent they were able to recruit to their schools. The separation of white colleges and black colleges was apparent long into the 40s and 50s. Some black players had played intermittently on college teams as early as the 1800s. Some of you might remember George Flippin at Nebraska in 1891, or the three Harvey brothers at KU in 1888. But clear through the 50s in the American Jim Crow South, black athletes were not allowed to play at majority white colleges. It wasn't just Johnny Bright. The SEC was right in the thick of it. The 1956 Sugar Bowl between the independent 7-3 Pittsburgh Panthers and the SEC's 8-1-1 Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets was one prime example of how segregation had placed its roots in the Southeastern Conference. The game was played in Tulane Stadium in New Orleans, right in the heart of SEC country. Pitt had a player on their team named Bobby Greer, who was black. Up until that point, games played between Northern and Southern teams were held under a, quote, gentleman's agreement that only white players from both squads would play. Black players would ride the bench. Georgia Tech's coaches and brass, though, weren't so keen on upholding the rule by the time 1956 rolled around. Then Georgia Governor Marvin Griffin sent a telegram to Tech's athletics department requesting that the Yellow Jackets not play the game, or at least ask that Greer not play. GT's president, Blake R. Van Leer, who was the president when GT first allowed women to take classes at the university, was a staunch supporter of ending desegregation in Southern universities and threatened to resign if the game wasn't played. Given the recent success of GT moving in Van Leer's direction as the new MIT of the South, his resignation would have likely crippled Georgia Tech's academic future. Pitt chose to play Greer, which caused an uproar of Georgia Tech fans. Coach Bobby Dodd of GT asked his players if they wanted to play the game against Pitt. They all said yes, and the game went on as normal. After the game, though, Governor Griffin publicly decreed that Georgia teams, including the Yellow Jackets and Bulldogs, would be barred from playing games against teams with black players. As I'm sure you know, that didn't last all that long. Mississippi State's 1959 basketball program was considered one of the best in the country, finishing the regular season at 24-1. But since the NCAA tournament would feature black athletes, Mississippi State declined to even go to the tournament. They wouldn't accept a bid to the postseason at all until 1963, where, in the second round, they would play Loyola, an integrated team, in what would later be known as the Game of Change. Mississippi State lost. It wasn't until the late 60s that the SEC began to finally integrate. For example, the University of Kentucky was the first SEC conference member to allow black scholarship players on its athletics programs to play in collegiate competition, with Nate Northington and Greg Page earning scholarships in 1965 and playing in 1967. The entire Big 8 conference had been integrated for 10 years by the time Northington saw the field for Kentucky, breaking the SEC's color barrier. In comparison, the other SoCon branch, the ACC, had all their schools integrated by 1970 when South Carolina finally did. As a whole, the SEC was the last major college sports conference to allow itself to be desegregated in 1972, with Ole Miss finally allowing black players to play for their athletics programs. But the SEC faced change in more than just the players on the field. The schools in their conference had also changed dramatically during the 60s. Like I covered in my video on these teams leaving the SEC, Georgia Tech and Tulane both voluntarily left the SEC in the 60s, but for drastically different reasons. Tech decided to leave and become an independent in 1964 after concerns about scholarship practices among the rest of the conference, namely over-signing recruits, made Coach Bobby Dodd so upset that he withdrew the team from the SEC himself. Tulane's departure in 1966 had a lot more to do with academics. While, like Sewanee, they were vastly overmatched in general athletics competition by the 60s, they decided to lessen scholarships voluntarily in order to retain focus from their student athletes on being an actual student. This process not only tanked the program, but almost forced them to shutter their football program entirely in the 80s. It's a decision that one could argue Tulane has never recovered from. By 1967, the SEC was down to just 10 members again: LSU, Ole Miss, Mississippi State, Alabama, Auburn, Georgia, Florida, Tennessee, Vanderbilt, and Kentucky. They would stay as this 10-team conference for over 20 years until the gears of college sports started turning once again, and the SEC was squarely in the middle of one of the largest shifts in college sports history.
All things great, all things that can be great, begin with a sound foundation. The 10 universities of the Southeastern Conference have been, are, and will continue to be committed to academic excellence, providing a sound foundation to what is great and what can be great. The Southeastern Conference, the foundation.
The landmark NCAA versus Board of Regents of the University of Oklahoma case in 1984 is the catalyst for everything that might be considered the modern era of college sports. Up until the 80s, the NCAA had sole control over the broadcast rights of athletics events between its members' universities. That meant they had sole rights to distribute and broadcast any event between NCAA members, of which the SEC was composed of. The SEC specifically had already established itself as a football powerhouse conference, and had a few member universities feel as though their current distribution system was robbing their athletics departments of potential television revenue dollars. In order to bypass this, a few schools across the country formed the College Football Association, which was essentially a union between athletics departments to negotiate and broadcast football games, as well as other sporting events. In response, the NCAA threatened to ban those colleges from NCAA competition against fellow schools, which would cripple the athletics departments of CFA-aligned schools. Alongside the Board of Regents of the University of Oklahoma, the University of Georgia Athletic Department decided to sue the NCAA for restraint of trade. The Supreme Court agreed, and the NCAA had to stand down. Now, universities and athletics departments, and by extension their conferences, were able to negotiate their own broadcast deals, and the SEC immediately struck it rich. With some of the most prominent football programs located in highly populated television markets with fans desperate to watch football, the SEC garnered one of the NCAA's largest broadcast deals as soon as it was available to them. To further bring in more eyeballs and bolster their potential dividends, the conference started sending out feelers for potential additions to the conference. They settled on a handful of universities, with the most prominent being the University of Texas, Texas A&M, and Arkansas from the Southwest Conference, and Independence Miami, West Virginia, South Carolina, and Florida State. Of those 7, the SEC was able to lure Arkansas and South Carolina into their conference, a Western and Eastern team, to begin play in the 1991 basketball season. This brought their total conference membership from 10 to 12, and also allowed them an interesting perk. They were able to create the first conference championship game, an extra game on the schedule between the 2 best performing members of each division, which would further bring in television revenue. This had other effects. The SEC's championship game not only spurred other conferences like the Big 8 to push for 12 members in the conference championship game, but the existence of championship games also helped push forward a new postseason championship game format known as the Bowl Coalition in 1992. The Bowl Coalition became the Bowl Alliance in 1995, which slowly morphed into the Bowl Championship Series, or BCS, in 1997. The SEC had unintentionally created the BCS, and they would kill it less than 25 years later after a late season loss by BCS number 2 Oklahoma State ended up creating a rematch of Alabama and LSU in the title game, a decision that was so unpopular that the steps toward creating a college football playoff were accelerated immensely. With 12 schools, it made sense to reorganize scheduling into 2 divisional structures, a Western and an Eastern division. The West featured Arkansas, LSU, Ole Miss, Mississippi State, Alabama, and Auburn, and the East featured Tennessee, Vanderbilt, Kentucky, Georgia, Florida, and South Carolina. But it only took 30 years for the SEC to expand again, this time focusing westward on the faltering Big 12. The Big 12 had faced hardships recently, almost losing most of their schools to the Pac-12 and losing Nebraska to the Big 10 over perceived domineering by the Texas athletics brass. 2 additional schools jumped ship in response. Texas A&M, who had long eyed SEC admission since before their time in the Big 12, and Missouri, who had originally jettisoned from the Big 12 in the hopes of following Nebraska to the Big 10, but happily found themselves in the SEC as a fallback option. Both would join the SEC in 2012. This brought the SEC to 14 total members, and while Texas A&M sat in the Western Division easily, Missouri's location in the East was definitely odd, unless you viewed the Eastern Division as a Northeast Division. While this did create an unfortunately familiar map, it also created another massive shift in college sports. Not only did it force the Big 12 to pivot, adding West Virginia and TCU to keep itself alive, but it also spurred the Big 10 Conference, a perceived rival of the SEC's, to get to 14 members themselves to match the SEC. They did this by poaching Maryland from the ACC and Rutgers from the newly renamed American Conference. By this point, it was official. The SEC and the Big 10 were on a collision course to determine the future of college athletics between the 2 of them. The term Super Conference had existed since the 80s, with the potential for a massive 16-team football-playing Metro Conference, which would have featured former SEC member Tulane and future SEC member South Carolina, being drawn up. But with growing issues in the West and the Big 12 Conference, and both Texas and Oklahoma threatening to leave to the Pac-12, Big 10, or SEC in the new era of college sports, it became clear that one of those conferences was going to be the first in the modern era to expand to 16, the largest since the SoCon had its great culling almost 100 years prior. Television contracts got bigger as the SEC won more and more national titles, especially in football under the tutelage of historically great coaches like Nick Saban, who won multiple national titles at football powerhouses in SEC schools LSU and Alabama. Steve Spurrier and Urban Meyer had carried the SEC torch and national championship wins at the University of Florida, and even brief periods of success for Tennessee and Auburn and a new period of resurgence for Georgia kept the conference consistently winning. It wasn't just restricted to football, though. The other main revenue sport, basketball, also featured the occasional national championship from SEC programs, with Kentucky winning 3 national titles since 1996, and Florida taking back-to-back national titles in 2006 and 2007. The SEC was must-see television for those who wanted to watch elite college sports, and their only real competition by the time 2020 rolled around was the Big Ten. With the new era of name, image, and likeness policies coming in to help players, and television contracts getting larger and larger than they ever had, both Oklahoma and Texas secretly reached out to the SEC to inquire about joining the conference. The move would quantify as a step up in pay for both universities, as the Big 12 was set to struggle financially when compared to the Big 10 and SEC. Once this was uncovered by then Texas A&M Athletic Director Ross Bjork, Pandora's box of realignment was opened. The SEC quickly moved to approve both the Longhorns and Sooners, despite Texas A&M's protests, and the Big 12 once again found itself on the chopping block. Their quick resurgence led to the eventual dissolution of the Pac-12 conference, at least in a power conference form, and the Big 10 adding 4 of that conference's most prominent teams. 2 titans now stand alone over college sports, with the SEC being one of them. The SEC's athletic dominance, while almost entirely due to their location in the recruiting hotbed of the American South, has been one of their pushing points for years. The conference lays claim to 43 football national championships earned by schools during their time as members of the SEC. This is compared to 44 from the Big Ten historically, 8 from the ACC, 29 from the old Pac-12, and 15 for the Big 12, if you assume they take the history of the Big 8, although only 2 of those championships reside with teams still in that conference. Ironically enough, though, 7 of those national championships come on the shoulders of one man, Nick Saban, who won 1 with LSU in 2003 and then 6 as the head coach of Alabama later on in his career. If you involve Saban's coaching tree to include SEC head coaches such as Kirby Smart, Saban is responsible for 9 of the SEC's national championships in football, a number that is almost assuredly the most in the modern era of college football. Nick Saban on his own accounts for 9 of the 14 national championships the SEC has won since the 2000 season. Take him out of it, and the SEC only claims 35 football championships, still the second most in the country by far. The SEC also claims 8 men's cross-country national champions and 2 women's cross-country championships, as well as 1 women's soccer championship, 1 volleyball championship, and no men's soccer championships. Wrong football, I guess. In the winter, it's the women who outduel the men for basketball dominance, with 12 national championships for the ladies compared to 11 for the men. They're both handled by dynasties, though, with Pat Summitt's Tennessee Lady Volunteers accounting for the first 8 of the SEC's women's national basketball championships, and the Kentucky Wildcats claiming 8 of the men's basketball natties. Florida remains the only school in NCAA history to win national championships in football and basketball in the same year. The SEC also has a small claim over women's gymnastics dominance and claims 20 national championships in men's and women's indoor track each. In the spring, the SEC claims 16 national championships in baseball, including a stretch of 6 championships for LSU from 1991 to 2009. But recently, there's been more parity in the conference, leading to more first-time championship wins for schools like Mississippi State, Tennessee, and new baseball powerhouse Vanderbilt. They also have 3 softball national titles. On the outdoor track, the SEC claims 23 men's national titles and 19 women's titles, as well as 19 titles between men's and women's tennis, and 20 between men's and women's golf. The SEC has built itself up through the years not just on the back of great teams, but great people, like Nick Saban, who I mentioned earlier. It's pretty much impossible to tell the story of the SEC without mentioning its terrific coaching history, with men like Bear Bryant, Bobby Dodd, Lou Holtz, and Vince Dooley calling the SEC home. Coach Bryant is so well known for his coaching acumen that one of the awards for Best Coach of the Year bears his name and also has been given to 8 SEC coaches since its inception in 1986. Basketball also shares a strong history in the SEC. Coaches like John Calipari and Rick Pitino at Kentucky, Billy Donovan at Florida, Eddie Sutton at Arkansas, Pat Summitt at Tennessee, and now Don Staley at South Carolina have ensured that the SEC continues to be one of the deepest basketball conferences in the country in terms of history. It's also focused on a lot of great players, not just great coaches. Of the 88 Heisman Trophy winners since 1935, 16 played at schools who were members of the SEC at the time they were playing. Of those 16, half of them have been won in the last 15 years alone. On the court, nobody can forget names like Pistol Pete Maravich and Shaquille O'Neal at LSU, Charles Barkley at Auburn, or Bernard King at Tennessee. Even the baseball field has played host to some of the greatest to ever step on the diamond, with Frank Thomas, Rafael Palmeiro, and Todd Helton having called the conference home. It's unclear what the future of college sports has in store, whether a super conference will form that will encompass nearly all of the former Power 5, or college sports ends up looking more and more like minor league sports with little to no connection to their universities. The long and short of it will be this: the SEC will be there. Why that is comes down to a few things. You could point to their recruiting grounds in the southern United States and predatory recruiting practices in the 70s and 80s that diminished the viability of HBCU programs. You could point to the consistent leadership of long-tenured dynastic coaches like Nick Saban or Pat Summitt. Or you could point to the fact that sports isn't just entertainment in the South. It's a way of life. Literally, life or death. People and trees have gotten seriously hurt just for identifying with the wrong school at the wrong time to the wrong people. It's different down south, hence why they cheer for their school first and the conference second. The SEC is here to stay, and wherever college sports goes, they'll be right there in the driver's seat.
The premier championship game of the SEC. Don't you miss it.